A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. Chapter 1. Marley was dead to begin with. There is no doubt whatever about that. The register of his burial was signed by the clergyman, the undertaker, and the chief mourner. Scrooge signed it. Old Marley was dead as a doornail. Scrooge knew he was dead. Of course he did. Scrooge and he were partners for I don't know how many years. Scrooge was his sole executor, his sole friend, and sole mourner. There is no doubt that Marley was dead. This must be distinctly understood, or nothing wonderful can come of the story I am about to relate. Scrooge never painted out Marley's name. There it stood years afterwards, above the warehouse door, Scrooge and Marley. Sometimes people called Scrooge Scrooge, and sometimes Marley. But he answered to both names. It was all the same to him. Oh, but he was a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone, Scrooge. A squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner. Hard and sharp as flint, secret and solitary as an oyster. The cold within him froze his old features, nipped his pointed nose, shriveled his cheek, made his lips thin, and spoke out shrewdly in his grating voice. He carried his own low temperature always about him. He iced his office in the dog days, and didn't thaw it 1 degree at Christmas. External heat and cold had little influence on Scrooge. No warmth could warm him, no wintry weather chill him. No wind that blew was bitterer than he. No falling snow was more intent upon its purpose. No pelting rain less open to entreaty. Nobody ever stopped him in the street to say with gladsome looks, "My dear Scrooge, how are you? When will you come to see me?" No beggars implored him to bestow a trifle. No children asked what o'clock it was. No man or woman ever once in all his life inquired the way to such and such a place. Of Scrooge, even the blindman's dogs appeared to know him, and when they saw him coming, would tug their owners into doorways and up courts, and then would wag their tails as though they said, "No eye at all is better than the evil eye, Dark Master." Once upon a time, on Christmas Eve, old Scrooge sat busy in his counting-house. It was cold, bleak, biting weather, foggy withal, and he could hear the people in the court outside go wheezing up and down, beating their hands upon their breasts and stamping their feet upon the pavement stones to warm them. The city had only just gone 3 on the clock, but it was quite dark already. It had been light all day, and candles were flaring in the windows of the neighboring offices, like ruddy smears upon the palpable brown air. The fog came pouring in at every chink and keyhole, and was so dense without that, although the court was the narrowest, the houses opposite seemed mere phantoms. To see the dingy cloud come drooping down, obscuring everything, one might have thought that nature lived hard by, and was brewing on a large scale. The door of Scrooge's counting-house was open that he might keep an eye on his clerk, who, in a dismal little cell beyond, a sort of tank, was copying letters. Scrooge had a small fire, but the clerk's fire was so very much smaller that he looked like one single coal was lighting the office. But he couldn't replenish it, for Scrooge kept the coal box in his own room, and so surely as the clerk came in with the shovel, the master predicted that it would be necessary for them to part. "A Merry Christmas, Uncle!" cried a cheerful voice. It was Scrooge's nephew who came in the door unnoticed. "Ah, humbug!" said Scrooge. This nephew of Scrooge's was ruddy and handsome, all aglow from rapid walking. "Christmas? A humbug, Uncle?" said Scrooge's nephew. "You don't mean that." "I do," said Scrooge. "Merry Christmas. What reason have you to be merry? You're poor enough." "What right have you to be dismal?" returned his nephew gaily. "You're all rich enough." Scrooge, having no better answer ready, said "Bah!" again, and followed it up with another "Humbug!" "Don't be cross," said the nephew. "What else can I be?" returned the uncle, "when I live in such a world of fools as this? Merry Christmas! What's Christmas time for you but a time for paying bills without money? A time for finding yourself a year older and not an hour richer." "If I could work my will," said Scrooge indignantly, "every idiot who goes about with Merry Christmas on his lips should be boiled in his own pudding and buried with a stake of holly through his heart, he should." "Uncle!" pleaded the nephew. "Nephew!" returned the uncle. "Keep Christmas in your own way, and I will keep it in mine." "Keep it?" repeated Scrooge's nephew. "But you don't keep it." "Let me leave it alone, then," said Scrooge. "Much good as it has ever done you." "There are many things from which I might have derived good, which I have not profited," returned the nephew. "I have always thought of Christmas as a good time. A kind, charitable, pleasant time. The only time when men open their shut-up hearts freely and think of people below them as they really were, fellow passengers to the grave, and not another race of creatures bound on other journeys. Therefore, though it has never put a scrap of gold or silver in my pocket, I believe it has done me good, will do me good, and I say God bless it." The clerk in the rank involuntarily applauded. "Let me hear another sound from you," said Scrooge, "and I'll keep your Christmas by losing your situation." "Don't be angry, Uncle. Come, dine with us tomorrow." "Good afternoon," said Scrooge, ignoring the invitation. "I want nothing from you. I ask nothing of you. Why can't we be friends?" "Good afternoon," said Scrooge. "I am sorry with all my heart to find you so resolute, but I have made the trial in homage to Christmas. So Merry Christmas, Uncle." His nephew left without an angry word, and as he departed, 2 people came in. They were pleasant gentlemen, who stood with their hats off in Scrooge's office. "Scrooge and Marley's, I believe," the one gentleman said. "Have I the pleasure of addressing Mr. Scrooge or Mr. Marley?" "Mr. Marley has been dead these 7 years," Scrooge replied. "He died 7 years ago this very night." "We have no doubt his generosity is well represented by his surviving partner," said the gentleman. Marley was well represented, all right, for they had been 2 kindred spirits at the ominous word generosity. Scrooge frowned. "At this festive season, Mr. Scrooge," said the gentleman, "a few of us are endeavoring to raise a fund to buy the poor some meat and drink and means of warmth. What shall we put you down for?" "Nothing," Scrooge replied. "Are there no prisons, no workhouses for these people?" "Oh, many would rather die than go there." "If they would rather die," said Scrooge, "they had better do it and decrease the surplus population. Besides, excuse me, I don't know that." "But you might well know it," observed the gentleman. "It's not my business," Scrooge returned. "It's enough for a man to understand his own business, and not interfere with other people's. Mine occupies me constantly. Good afternoon, gentlemen." Seeing that it would be useless to pursue their point, the gentlemen withdrew. Scrooge resumed his labors, for an improved opinion of himself and a better temper than was usual. Meanwhile, the fog and darkness thickened. The ancient church tower, whose old bell was always peeping slyly down on Scrooge out of the Gothic window in the wall, became invisible and struck the hours. In the clouds, with tremulous vibrations afterwards, as if its teeth were chattering in the frozen head, the piercing, biting cold became intense. A boy, gnawed and numbed by the hungry cold as bones are gnawed by dogs, stooped down at Scrooge's keyhole to regale him with a Christmas carol. But at the first sound of "God bless you, merry gentlemen," Scrooge seized the ruler with such energy of action that the singer fled in a single terror. At length, the hour of shutting up the counting-house arrived. With an ill will, Scrooge dismounted from his stool and tactically admitted the fact to the expectant clerk in the tank, who instantly snuffed his candle out and put on his hat. "You'll want all day tomorrow, I suppose," said Scrooge. "If it's convenient, sir. If it's quite convenient." "It's not convenient," said Scrooge. "It's not fair. If I want to stop £half-a-crown for it, you'd think yourself ill-used, I'll be bound." The clerk smiled faintly. "And yet," said Scrooge, "you don't think me ill-used when I pay a day wages for no work." The clerk observed that it was only once a year. "A poor excuse for picking a man's pocket every 25th of December," said Scrooge, buttoning his coat to his chin. "But I suppose you must have the whole day. Be here all the earlier the next morning." The clerk promised that he would, and Scrooge walked out with a growl. The office was closed in a twinkling, and the clerk, with the long ends of his white comforter dangling below his waist, for he wore no greatcoat, went down with a slide on Cornhill, at the end of the lane of boys, 20 times, in honor of it being Christmas Eve, and then ran home to Camden Town as fast as he could, to play blindman's buff. Scrooge took his melancholy dinner in his usual melancholy tavern, and having read all the newspapers and beguiled the rest of the evening with his banker's books, went home to bed. He lived in chambers which had once belonged to his deceased partner. They were a gloomy suite of rooms in a lowering pile of buildings, up a dilapidated yard. The yard was so dark that even Scrooge, who knew it every stone, was fain to grope with his hands. The fog and frost so hung about this old gateway of the house that it seemed as if the genius of the weather sat in mournful meditation at the threshold. Now, it is fact that there was nothing at all particular about the knocker on the door, except that it was very large. It is also a fact that Scrooge had seen it night and morning during his whole residence in that place. Also that Scrooge had a little of what is called fancy about him, as any man in London. Let it also be remembered that Scrooge had not bestowed one thought on Marley since his last mention of his 7 years dead partner that afternoon. And then, Let any man explain to me, if he can, how it happened that Scrooge, having his key in the lock of the door, saw in the knocker, without it undergoing any immediate progress of change, not a knocker, but Marley's face. Marley's face, it was not impenetrable shadow, as the other objects in the yard were, but had a dismal light about it. It was not angry, but looked at Scrooge as Marley used to look, with ghostly spectacles turned up upon its ghostly forehead. The hair was curiously stirred, as if by breath or hot air, and though the eyes were open wide, they were perfectly motionless. That, and its livid color, made it horrible. As Scrooge looked fixedly on the phenomenon, it was the knocker again. To say that he was not startled, or that his blood was not conscious of the terrible sensation to which it had been a stranger from infancy, would be untrue. But he put his hand upon the key, turned it sturdily, walked in, and lighted his candle. He did pause before he shut the door, and he did look cautiously behind it, as if he half expected to be terrified with the sight of Marley's pigtail sticking out the back of the door. But there was nothing there, except the screws and nuts that held the knocker on. So he said, "Pooh, pooh," and closed it with a bang. The sound resounded through the house like thunder. Scrooge was not a man to be frightened by echoes. He fastened the door, and walked across the hall up the stairs, slowly too, trimming his candle as he went. As Scrooge went, not caring a button for the darkness of the staircase. Darkness is cheap, and Scrooge liked it. But before he shut his heavy door, he walked through his rooms to see that all was right. Sitting room, bedroom, lumber room, all as they should be. Nobody under the table, nobody under the sofa, a small fire in the grate, spoon and basin ready, and the little saucepan of gruel. Scrooge had a cold in his head. Upon the hob, nobody under the bed, nobody in the closet, nobody in his dressing gown, which was hanging up against the wall. Quite satisfied, he closed his door, and locked himself in. Double-locked himself in, which was not his custom. Thus secured against surprise, he took off his cravat, put on his dressing gown and slippers, and his nightcap, and sat down before the fire to take his gruel. His gaze wandered as his glance rested upon the bell that hung in the room. It was with great astonishment and with a strange, inexplicable dread that he saw the bell begin to swing. It swung so softly in the outlet that it scarcely made a sound, but soon it rang loudly, and so did every bell in the house. This might have lasted half a minute, but it seemed like an hour. They were succeeded by a clanking noise, deep down below, as if some person were dragging a heavy chain. Scrooge then remembered to have heard that ghosts in haunted houses were described as dragging chains. The cellar door flew with a booming sound, and then he heard the noise much louder, on the floors below, then coming up the stairs, then coming straight toward the door. "It's humbug still," said Scrooge. "I won't believe it." His color changed, though, when without a pause it came on through the door and passed the room before his eyes. Upon its coming, the dying flame in the fireplace leapt up, as though it cried, "I know him, Marley's ghost," and fell again. The same face, the very same. Marley in his pigtail, usual waistcoat, tights and boots, the tassels on the latter bristling like pigtail and coat skirts, and the hair upon his head. The chain he drew was clasped about his middle. It was long and wound about him like a tail. It was made of cash boxes, keys, padlocks, ledgers, deeds, and heavy purses wrought of steel. His body was transparent, so that Scrooge, observing him and looking through his waistcoat, could see the buttons on his coat behind. Scrooge refused to believe it even now, though he looked the phantom through and saw it was standing before him, though he felt the chilling influence of his death-cold eyes, and marked the texture of the handkerchief bound about his head and chin, used as a wrapper he had not observed before. He was still incredulous and fought against his senses. "How now?" said Scrooge, caustic and cold as ever. "What do you want with me?" "Much." Marley's voice, no doubt about it. "Who are you?" "In life, I was your partner, Jacob Marley. You don't believe me," observed the ghost. "Do not your senses convince you of my reality?" "No," said Scrooge. "The littlest thing affects them. A slight disorder of the stomach makes them cheat. You may be a bit of undigested beef or crumb of cheese. There's more of gravy than the grave about you, whoever you are." Scrooge was not much taken in the habit of cracking jokes. The truth is that he tried to be smart as a means of distracting his own attention, and keeping down his terror, for the spectre's voice disturbed the very marrow of his bones. "You see this toothpick?" "You see this toothpick," said Scrooge. "I have but to swallow this, and be for the rest of my days persecuted by a legion of goblins, all of my own creation. Humbug, I tell you, humbug!" At this, the spirit raised a frightful cry, and shook its chains with such appalling noise that Scrooge held it tight on to his chair to save himself from falling in a swoon. But how much greater was his horror when the phantom, taking off the bandage round his head as if it were too warm to wear indoors, its lower jaw dropped upon its breast. Scrooge fell upon his knees and clasped his hands before his face. "Mercy!" he cried. "Dreadful apparition! Why do you trouble me?" "Do you believe in me or not?" replied the ghost. "I do," said Scrooge. "But why do spirits walk the earth, and why do they come to me?" "It is required of every man," the ghost returned, "that the spirit within him should walk abroad among his fellow men, and travel far and wide, and if that spirit does not go forth in life, it is condemned to go so after death. It is doomed to wander through the world, oh, is me, and witness what it cannot share, but might have shared on earth, and turned to happiness." Again the spectre raised a cry, and shook its chain and wrung its shadowy hands. "Why are you so fettered?" said Scrooge, trembling. "I wear the chain I forged in life," replied the ghost. "I made it link by link. I girded it on my own free will, and of my free will I wore it. Is its pattern strange to you?" Scrooge trembled more and more. "Do you not know," pursued the ghost, "the weight and length of the strong coil you bear yourself?" "Jacob!" he implored. "Oh, Jacob Marley, speak comfort to me." "I have none to give," the old ghost replied. "I cannot stay. I cannot linger anywhere. My spirit never walked beyond our counting house. Mark me, in life my spirit never roved beyond the narrow limits of our money-changing hole, and weary journeys lie before me. 7 years dead, and traveling all this time?" "The whole time," said the ghost. "No rest, no peace, incessant torture of remorse." Then the ghost set upon another cry, and clanked its chain hideously. "Oh, captive, bound, and double-ironed!" cried the phantom. "Not to know that any Christian spirit, working kindly in its little sphere, whatever that may be, will find its mortal life too short for its vast means of usefulness. Not to know that no space of regret can make amends for one's life's opportunity misused, yet such as I." "But you were always a good man of business, Jacob," faltered Scrooge, who now began to apply this to himself. "Business? Mankind was my business. The common welfare was my business. Charity, mercy, forbearance, and benevolence were all my business. The dealings of my trade were a drop of water in an ocean of my business." It held its chain and flung it heavily upon the ground. "At this time of year," the spectre said, "I suffer most. Why did I walk through crowds of fellow beings with my eyes turned down, and never raise them, that the blessed star which led the wise men to the poor abode? Were there no poor homes to which its light would have conducted me?" Scrooge was much dismayed at what the spectre said, and began to quake exceedingly. "Hear me!" cried the ghost. "My time is nearly gone." "I will," said Scrooge. "Don't be hard upon me, Jacob." "How is it that I appear before you in a shape you can see, I may tell not? I am here to warn you. You may have yet a chance of hope of escaping my fate. The chance of hope of procuring Ebenezer." "Oh, thank ye," said Scrooge. "You will be haunted," resumed the ghost, "by 3 spirits." Scrooge's countenance fell. "Is that the chance? Is that the chance you mentioned, Jacob?" he demanded, his voice faltering again. "Expect the first tomorrow when the bell tolls once. Expect the second on the right next at the time of hour. The third upon the next night, when the last stroke of 12 has ceased to vibrate. Look to me, no more, and for your own sake, remember what has passed between us." When it had said these words, the spectre took its wrapper and bound it round its head, and as before, the apparition walked backwards from Scrooge, and at every step it took, the window opened a little, so that when the spectre reached it, it had opened wide. Scrooge became sensible of noises in the air, incoherent sounds of lamentation and regret, wailing, inexpressibly sorrowful and self-accusatory. The spectre joined in the mournful dirge, and then floated out upon the bleak, dark night. Scrooge rushed in the window and looked out. The air filled with phantoms, wandering in restless haste, and moaning as it went. Every one wore chains. Many had been personally known to Scrooge in their lives. An old ghost, a monstrous iron safe attached to its ankle, cried at being unable to assist a wretched woman with an infant whom it saw below upon a doorstep. The misery with them all was clearly that they sought to interfere for good in human manners and have lost the power forever. The creatures disappeared. Scrooge closed the window and examined the door by which the ghost had entered. It was double-locked. He tried to say humbug, but stopped. He went straight to bed, without undressing, and fell asleep upon the instant. Chapter 1 of Charles Dickens, A Christmas Carol. See you next week.